I was interested in seeing this from PBS because, for a while on Twitter, I saw just constant nonstop discourse from people like, I don't know, Will Stancil or whatever, about the vibe session. The idea that actually the economy is doing great and the fact that everyone's unhappy is because they're not smart enough to realize that the numbers have gone up or something. I want to see how PBS covers this. I've given my opinion on this plenty of times, leaving aside the fact that from a sociological perspective, widespread discontent and anxiety is a problem in itself, right? Like you can't just point to the numbers and say like, oh no, statistically you are happy and then fix it, right? Obviously there is an issue there. And secondly, I don't think people look at all the indicators. There are certain standards like, housing availability, rent costs. You're not getting a positive look at the economy if you're only looking at like the GDP or job availability or whatever. What about underemployment? Here.
Today's latest jobs report is proof again of a labor market that has been resilient and often stronger than expected. That was part of President Biden's message during his State of the Union last night as well. But many Americans don't feel the economy is strong overall or helping them or their families.
This is often because the jobs report usually indicates how many jobs there are, but doesn't talk about stuff like underemployment. So oftentimes you'll have statistics like this overinflated by the fact that it is easy to find work right now. If you want a job, it's not that hard to find one, but a lot of those jobs suck and don't pay enough for, comfortable living in the area that you live in. Sometimes people have multiple like gig work jobs that kind of overlap in terms of timing. There's a lot of stuff that like gets messed up here. Sociologically, people's anxiety and discontent with the economy is itself a problem. I'm not denying the data. The GDP is up. Job availability is up. Our economy is resilient. But, as is so often the case, the resiliency of this economy and how well the money within that economy gets distributed, not always the same thing, right? You can't learn about the like equality, fairness, or happiness of an economy just by looking at numbers like GDP or job availability or whatever, It doesn't always tell you the full story. In fact, it often doesn't, Oftentimes, a sudden rise in job availability and GDP actually corresponds with a dip in the quality of living. Like you can point to this really easy in early industrialization. That's an extreme example, of course, but just an indication that these trends aren't always connected. There are other factors to look at, too.
A number of polls have shown this, including one from the New York Times this week that found 51% of Americans believe the country's economic conditions are poor right now. So why the disconnect? Economics correspondent Paul Salman explained.
I think if you talk to average person on the street, they're going to say that the economy is not doing well. And I tend to agree.
Seth Reed is an ESL teacher in Northern Virginia.
I'm doing fine, but still, living paycheck to paycheck.
How many bikes do you have on the docket today?
Alyssa Gonzalez co-owns the Treehouse Cyclery in Denver.
I've kind of accepted more of like a realistic view of the world where things aren't going to get better.
Nonprofit executive Eric Hicks was the most succinct.
I don't feel great.
But how can people feel so bad and even tell pollsters just that if the economy has been doing so well? Low unemployment, inflation easing.
I publish these social media videos every day, TikTok, Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts. And what was interesting...
Kyla Scanlon is a writer, social media personality, and demystifier of economics.
I was getting like hundreds of comments a day telling me how people were perceiving the economy. Because I would make a video being like, inflation is going down, like the labor market's okay. And people were like, no, I feel really bad.
The word she coined to describe what she was hearing, vibe session.
The vibe session is this idea of a disconnect between consumer sentiment and economic data and why people feel bad about the economy despite...
So the issue that I take with this language isn't that people often have incorrect... Okay, man, this is a really complicated subject because we know for a fact that people are more likely to think that the economy is doing well under a Republican president because people arbitrarily believe that Republicans are better with the economy. It's not true. But it's such a widespread belief that like the market goes up, the average like stock index goes up when a Republican takes office, Also, it is worth noting that people are probably a lot less responsible with their finances than they used to be. I think that this is not just a matter of personal responsibility, but also a matter of the economy being streamlined to incentivize constant consumption. People travel and buy stupid bullshit way more often now than they used to. If you went back, say, 60 or 70 years, I mean, let's say 60 years, right? Let's say it's like mid-60s, okay? People back then, not all people, but a lot of people, people think of that time as having some pretty good elements economically. Depends, it varies, it's complicated. But if you took a look, how often do you think people ate out at restaurants back then? How often do you think people bought new clothes? How often do you think people engaged in petty renovations of their own house, or bought doodads, or other trinkets, or toys, or anything interesting? Pretty rarely. Even middle-class families back then, a new item of clothing would be you get a new item of clothing, or two. You wouldn't go out to restaurants that often. That was saved for special occasions. But nowadays, when I look at other people my age or younger, I see a lot of people who are not doing well economically, but they eat out like 4 times a week, and they buy a lot of weed, and they shop a lot, and they travel, and they're always economically anxious. They're able to do these things because the cost of doing these things has gone down a lot, significantly. Traveling, flying, hotels, new clothes, even eating out at restaurants proportional to the average income, all of it's cheaper than it used to be. And yes, widespread credit card use also allows you to sort of asymmetrically spend your money, like in a temporal sense. Spend now what you don't have, pay it off later. How do you square this with the keeping up with the Joneses phenomena that was a thing back in the 60s? If anything, I think it reinforces it, that consumption back then was done purposefully and conscientiously enough that suburban families would actively think about it in the context of one another, as opposed to it being a constant thing. We don't do it as much now, and we also didn't do it as much back then. The keeping up with the Joneses phenomenon described a very specific upper middle class subset of white suburbia. Whatever the case may be, I'm talking broadly about consumptive habits. We do eat out more. We do buy stuff more than we used to. Now, if everyone was more responsible with their money, would people still feel like we were in a recession? Would people still feel bad about the economy? A lot of them would. I bet you a lot of people, if they were much more responsible with their finances, wouldn't feel that way. So why have so many people gotten so much less responsible? I think it's because of third places. I'm bringing it right back around to civil planning. I think it's about third places. I think that nowadays it feels like there's no way to hang out with people without spending money. Places to walk to, places to spend time at. I think that we're more cynical, isolated, alienated. It's difficult for people to imagine doing things together that don't, involve that. I think that people have gotten worse at basic life skills like home upkeep and cooking. So people are more likely to eat out if they want good food, even though you can make good food at home for a very small fraction of the cost. I think that people are encouraged to buy fast fashion bullshit they're only going to wear a few times because people are seeing less and less meaning in their lives socially. So they pursue empty commodity acquisition as a substitute for something they might have had a while back, having friends they hang out with or community spaces they go to. In short, I think the economy has been deliberately streamlined to make people spend to their absolute limit. And in order to facilitate that, people's options for other things, for other ways of living their life, have been stripped bare. And that's made people less responsible because they think there's less to be responsible for. Does that make sense? Okay, that's my point. Anyway, let's continue.
To the economic metrics, telling them that the economy is doing okay.
In fact, the Consumer Sentiment Index has noticeably improved, says economist Justin Wolfers.
People seem to be a little bit more willing to admit that, in fact, that long nightmare of the post-pandemic recession and hard times and recovery is behind us, and people seem a little more willing to admit that things are doing okay.
But many Americans say they remain unhappy with the economy. Why the disconnect? Well, the key reason for a lot of people, prices are still higher than they were.
Okay, Vosh, but I live really frugally. Doesn't change that I can't afford a house. Yeah, I'm not disagreeing. That's an example of something where it's just inaccessible relative to how it used to be.
Pre-COVID. Seth Reed used to shop at Safeway right next to his apartment. Now he drives to Aldi for less expensive groceries.
Everything's going up in price.
But lower inflation doesn't mean lower prices. It just means prices are rising more slowly than they were, Scanlon explains.
If you're thinking that inflation going down means that prices are going down, you're going to be very confused when you go to the store and your box of cereal is not cheaper.
That is true. The average American probably does think that inflation is going down means prices are going down. Also, good Lord, look at this. $8 for cereal marked down to $6? Jesus Christ.
You're like, but I heard on the media that inflation is going down. What's going on?
Well, cereal prices barely budged this past year, but they rose by more than 25% during the pandemic and still aren't back to where they were pre-COVID.
They're not going to be. We don't have a deflationary currency. What does inflation mean then? Inflation describes the decreasing value of a currency. Like month over month, the projected yearly amount that the currency's value will degrade is based on its ability to purchase a distributed average value of a bunch of, life necessities.
Same for eggs, which nearly tripled, but at today's average of $2.50 a dozen, still almost double what they were pre-COVID. Alyssa Gonzalez now looks for cheaper items.
A lot more canned foods, boxed foods, just like 12-pack of ramen noodles.
This is how everyone used to buy food, by the way. Like when you went to a grocery store, the food people bought was bulk cooking items and like produce and stuff, The modern phenomena of everyone's grocery carts being packed entirely with snack foods, chips, pretzels, and frozen food, which is many times more expensive per calorie than making it yourself, and it tastes worse. Like this is a more modern thing.
Because it gets the job done.
And food manufacturers themselves have pushed prices higher than their costs, says Scanlon.
Firms are out there just raising prices, and they're telling you that in their earnings reports. They're like, yeah, we're going to expand our profits.
This is so-called greedflation. Firms taking advantage of consumer expectations that prices will keep going up. And why wouldn't?
You're telling me private companies raise their price above the cost of producing the goods so they can get a profit?
Like, well, duh, they're going to do that. Like, they're companies.
Yeah.
That's their goal, is to make a bunch of money.
And then there's shrinkflation. Firms charging the same for what turns out to be a lesser quantity. Here are recent examples flagged by the website Consumer World.
You're getting less and you're paying more. The little divot at the bottom of sauce containers is becoming more, so you're getting less sauce. And it's kind of ridiculous, to be honest.
There's one group especially sensitive to food prices, the least well off, who spend more of their budget on food.
They're not able to make ends meet.
Eric Hicks runs a Denver area food bank.
The community and the members who are coming to access services aren't able to pay for the rising prices in groceries and food and other resources.
And get this, cheaper food went up at twice the rate of premium foods during the pandemic. But to Scanlon, the real killer is housing. House prices have gone up, mortgage rates, and people's rents.
And so when you tell them that things are getting cheaper, but their rent is not getting cheaper and their food is not getting cheaper, of course they're going to feel bad.
It feels a little daunting to know that I'll be renting for a while and renting prices going up so much every year.
For Alyssa Gonzalez, home ownership is out of the question.
I don't believe that I will be able to buy a house. It's something that I've kind of just accepted.
So many face additional financial stressors with the end of COVID checks and the higher cost of borrowing. And then there's the renewal of student debt payments. Gonzalez has over $100,000 worth.
If I factor
Well, yeah, you're a co-owner of a place called Treehouse Cyclery. I could have told you that, yeah. Could have guessed that, I feel.
that into, my normal bills of close to $2,000 a month for just rent and then groceries and all the other things, and it's just not feasible.
Not feasible for Gonzalez to pay back her student loans.
It sucks because I'm not going to ever be able to pay off that debt. And it's one of the things that impacts me with my credit and being a business owner and just being able to apply for loans and get cars or anything like that. And so it kind of feels unsolvable, but it's so big of a problem that there's nothing I feel like I can do about it.
Even yuppies feel worse than they did during COVID.
Who says
The yuppie
yuppies?
lifestyle subsidy was in full force. Ubers were cheap, Airbnbs were cheap, food delivery apps were cheap.
But not anymore. So Brett Mead's fellow yuppies feel relatively worse off.
I think they feel negative about the economy in part because their cost of living has gone up.
But economist Wolfers thinks something else is driving the pessimism, reflected in some polls.
The way that people answer these public opinion poll questions has fundamentally changed. What they tend to do, instead of saying, well, here's the newspaper articles I read and here's what I see.
I feel like this isn't doing much to substantively address the issue, you know? Like, could they not have gone a little bit more into the numbers, I guess, or talked a little bit more about...
Around me, they think,
I guess
is my team winning right now? My team being Republicans or Democrats? Those who lean Republican reliably now were more optimistic under Trump and incredibly pessimistic under Biden, and Democrats are the opposite. What I think that tells us is less about the reality of the economy and more about how partisan and polarized views have become.
Even so, the economic reality for Seth Reed, at least, compared to that of his parents at his age, is kind of a bummer.
They had a house, they had 2 cars, they had stable incomes. They were definitely much more stable than I feel. Rising costs of childcare are the #1 reason why my fiance and I haven't even thought about having kids in the near future.
So maybe it should come as no surprise. A statistically good economy for many, but for more than a few Americans, bad economic vibe.
But it's not a vibe. I don't understand the messaging of this video.
The PBS NewsHour, Paul Salman.
Like, isn't the content of the video about how it's not a vibe? I don't understand this video at all. Comments are turned off, but that's my favorite part. They really undercut most of what was said in the video. Yeah, it makes it feel kind of smarmy and disingenuous. I don't really know. Yeah, Annie, I don't really know, like, you would have to look at examples of how people are doing, like the very poor people, I suppose. Some responsible ones. I'll say this much, okay? Don't use food delivery apps. Don't do it. Back for what you were saying about Gen Z spending, though, I don't know if it's really a responsibility thing so much as younger gens realize there's no chance of retiring or benefiting from long-term saving. Okay, but this is just stupid. I'm sorry, this is just Gen Z and millennials being stupid. Saving for the future is an objectively good thing to do. That's not like... This is just needless pessimism. Yes, you should save for the future. Can't save for the future when I barely pay rent. Don't be thick. The title here, 45% of Gen Z and millennials don't see the point in saving for the future. We're not talking about the ability to save for the future. We're talking about whether or not it's worthwhile to save for the future.